So someone very special recently had a birthday. I'm gonna give you a hint. It's someone a lot of people know. It's somebody who's quite old. And it's somebody who has the letter E in their name. Okay, so I know what you're thinking. Earth Day. And that's a very good guess. Kind of. But that's not exactly who I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to talk about Shakespeare's birthday. A couple of years ago, I actually took a class on Shakespeare and traveled to the UK to see a lot of his plays and hang out in Stratford, his birthplace, and learn a lot about him. And although those days are behind me, partly because I graduated and partly because we're in a pandemic, I thought it would be fun to talk a little bit today about some retellings of Shakespeare in novel form. There are a lot of different kinds of Shakespeare retellings that I have personally read, so I think that in here there will be a little bit of something for almost everybody. Maybe not quite everybody. I sadly am only one human without a lot of years of experience yet. So if I miss your favorite genre, I'm sorry. We all knew I wasn't a perfect robot. I'm gonna roughly group these by like which play they're a retelling of. So the first one, I'm roughly grouping these by like what play they're a retelling of, and I'm going to start with a retelling of my personal favorite Shakespeare play, which is Much Ado About Nothing. This is a play that I think is a little bit less commonly taught in most schools. If you know a lot about Shakespeare, you definitely know about this play, but if you only know a little bit, you probably don't. And that's kind of a shame because I think it's one of his most fun plays. It tackles some issues that are still very current now, especially to do with like gender relations and victim blaming. And it also has probably one of the best couple, definitely the best couple in Shakespeare, if not one of the best couples in English literature so far, which is Beatrice and Benedick. Beatrice and Benedick in part inspired Elizabeth and Darcy from Pride and Prejudice. And of course, we all know what happened after that. I've only read one novel retelling of Much Ado About Nothing so far, and it's called The Only Thing Worse Than Me Is You by Lily Anderson. It's a young adult novel. It's set at a sort of a prestigious private high school where everybody is super competitive trying to get into college, and of course, Trixie, the Beatrice character, and Ben, the Benedick character, are the most competitive of all. They're constantly duking it out for places 3 and 4 in their class ranking because, of course, Hero and Claudio, I don't actually remember their names in the book because it's been a few minutes since I read this book, to be honest. But Hero and Claudio are always number 1 and 2, and so Ben and Trixie are trying to figure out who's going to be number 3 and 4, and they have this fun rivalry going on that occasionally gets kind of bitter, but I mean, so it does in the play too. And if you're not familiar with the play, here's basically what happens. Hero and Claudio get together. Hero is, in the play, she's Beatrice's cousin, and in this book, she's just Trixie's best friend. And then Claudio in the play is like a new guy in town. I don't think he's really a new guy in the book, but he shows up and he falls in love with Hero. They get together, and then something happens to drive them apart. Meanwhile, Beatrice and Benedick are these two characters who have known each other a long time, and they both love sort of digging into each other and arguing with each other. And a while ago, they kind of liked each other, but then something happened and they just sort of split up a little bit, although they weren't really together in the first place, I don't think. Some other friends of theirs had this scheme that they're going to get the two of them together because they think they'd be funny together. And so they each tell the other one that the other one is in love with them. So they tell Beatrice that Benedick's in love with her, and then vice versa to Benedick, and then they actually do end up falling in love. But I think they were a little bit in love before that, so I don't think it really counts. It's been several years since I've read this book. Probably 4 to 5 years, and I've never reread it. I wasn't able to get a hold of it at the library to reread it for this video, but what I remember about it is just how fun it was. More and more during the pandemic, I find myself trying to reach for more fun books, or at least darkly witty books. And this book I look on with a kind of nostalgia. It's about these teenagers that are very nerdy and are always making Doctor Who references and Sherlock references. And it's just really good-spirited and fun. I also remember there were some ways that it like differed from the original play, but those ways actually like made sense. Obviously, there's a lot of this play that you can't 100% faithfully adapt to a modern setting, and so I thought, without spoiling anything, that this book did a decent job of tweaking a few things so that it was more or less believable in a high school setting. So yeah, this one is really fun, really lighthearted. It has a ton of nerd references. If you can get a hold of it at the library, I highly recommend it for that. Now, if you want something that's like even more fun than that, if you want mega fun, if you want so much fun that you think you might explode, then I will recommend To Be or Not to Be and Romeo and or Juliet by Ryan North. These are choose your own adventure comic versions of Hamlet and Romeo and Juliet. I own both of them, but unfortunately they're not here, so I can't hold up the book for you. And they start on page 1, you pick what character you are, and then you get to sort of make choices throughout the book. And it's really fun not only to see what path awaits you depending on which character you choose, but also to go back and choose different paths. And you end up in a lot of very interesting situations. For example, in Hamlet, you can obviously choose to be Hamlet, but you can also choose to be Ophelia, and there's a timeline where Ophelia is like a scientist and creates like lots of cool things. I think she might invent time travel, actually, which is pretty rad because Ophelia in Hamlet, I think, got much less than she deserved. Also, in Romeo and or Juliet, there is a section where you can be in like an RPG version of the story and you can like play as the nurse, like a robot nurse actually, which is really interesting. And so you can like sort of play a role-playing game through the pages. There's also stories within stories for both of these things, so you can like explore other Shakespeare plays in short form in both To Be or Not to Be and in Romeo and or Juliet. It's very snarky and funny, and the art is also really cute. So this is a really good way to spend an afternoon if you've got some time. Just sort of check it out and lie on your bed and procrastinate everything else you have to do for your 5 graduate classes while you flip through pages. Now, if you're looking for something maybe a little bit more adult and you want to maybe challenge yourself and read a retelling of a play that is extremely controversial, then Vinegar Girl by Anne Tyler might be a good bet for you. This is a retelling of The Taming of the Shrew. Now, Is that my stomach? Oh my god. I have some feelings about The Taming of the Shrew. I remember watching it for the first time when I was about 12. I attended a school production of it. I have no idea why 12-year-olds were putting on this play, but they were. And I remember being absolutely incensed, like furious. I think that was the first day I really realized I was a feminist. So if you are somehow blissfully unfamiliar with The Taming of the Shrew, it entails 2 sisters, one of whom, the older of whom, is very strong and independent and a little bit scary some of the time, and the younger of whom is very popular and sweet and pretty, and their father wants to marry the younger one off because there are lots of people who want to marry her, but nobody wants to marry his older daughter, and that would be really embarrassing if the older one stayed unmarried while the younger one was married. And then a guy who really wants to marry Bianca, the younger one, sets up a whole scheme where he gets someone to date Katharine, who's the older one. And this guy, Petruchio? And this guy, Petruchio, he's basically just in it for the money. He just wants a wife who's rich. He doesn't really care. And so he sets about to tame her, which involves A, starving her, B, imprisoning her in her own room in his house without allowing her to talk to anybody, C, ordering his servants to not listen to anything that she says, and then at the end, he basically browbeats her into agreeing with everything he says, even if she doesn't really agree with it. And this is supposed to be a rom-com, guys. Although I will say there are some interpretations of the play that say, oh no, Shakespeare was actually trying to make a statement, but it's honestly sort of unclear like whether or not this is happening. And it depends on how the particular production decides to stage it. The way I saw it staged the first time was like played completely straight, and it was really awful, honestly. I decided to pick up this novel this month for Shakespeare's birthday, and also because I thought it could be interesting to read a retelling of a play that I really hate. And though I didn't really hate this book, I enjoyed a lot of it. It's sort of a gentle satire of like middle-class American life, which is sort of what Anne Tyler is known for, from what I've heard. Kate, especially, the protagonist, is a very fun and sympathetic character. She sort of wants to be left alone and not have anybody bother her too much. And she actually works in a preschool, which sounds like a weird setting for a Kate-like character, but she really likes working with little kids because they're very blunt and they say what they think, and she can say what she thinks back to them, which makes her good with the kids, not really great with their parents. And the pairing in question in this version is actually a green card marriage. Her father's assistant needs to stay in the country for a little bit longer and his visa's almost up, so he persuades Kate to marry him so that he can stay a little bit longer. The writing in this one is good. It's funny and it's ironic, but it's not too heavy. And I actually was quite enjoying this one and thought it would be one of my favorites of the month. And then I got to the end. The thing about the end is, if you know anything about the play, I think it tries a bit too hard to stay faithful to the original, and it doesn't quite carry out the point that I wanted it to, and so that was a little frustrating for me, but that's all I'm going to say about it because I don't want to spoil it for anybody who might read it. So I think that if you are somebody who enjoys witty comedies and gentle satires, comedies of manners, things like that, I think you might enjoy this one. Now let's move on to A Midsummer Night's Dream. I think the only version of this I've read relatively recently is the story in Sandman Volume 3, which is called A Midsummer Night's Dream, and it's where Shakespeare's acting troupe is putting on a performance of A Midsummer Night's Dream, but they're performing for the actual characters in the play but in real life. So like Queen Titania is there, King Oberon is there, Puck is there, a couple of other people that I can't remember right now. And Dream, who's the protagonist of Sandman, he's the one who's like helping put this on. There are a couple different Sandman issues that deal with Shakespeare. I do think this issue is fun and I enjoyed it, but it wasn't like a huge standout for me even in this volume, which has several different like short vignettes. But interestingly, this issue has become like a major favorite among Sandman fans, among comics fans, among science fiction and fantasy people. It was the first comic to win the World Fantasy Award for short story, and then the year after that they disqualified comics from that category, so it's the only one that will ever win the World Fantasy Award for short story. I don't know, maybe I'm like missing something, but I thought it was fine. I don't know, I kind of think people see Shakespeare and they just start freaking out. I don't blame them, I mean, same. But Sandman is basically my favorite comic series ever, one of my favorite series ever, honestly. So it's definitely not the best the series has to offer, but it still is fun and an interesting take on the story, and one that I hadn't necessarily seen before, so I would recommend it for that reason. If you're completely new to the Sandman series, though, I would just recommend starting with Volume 1, Preludes and Nocturnes. The Sandman series can occasionally get a bit gory. There's one particular issue in Volume 1 called 24 Hours that's really, really intense, and if you can get through that, you can get through the entire series because there's nothing more gory than that later on, but I just thought I would put that out there in case anybody would like to know about that and wants to read it. Next up is a retelling of The Tempest that I've actually already talked about on this channel. It's called Miranda in Milan by Katharine Duckett. It's a more historically grounded retelling. It is set in Italy. It's actually a sequel to The Tempest, and it talks about Miranda's life coming to be Ferdinand. Is that his name? He's really not important in the book, so it doesn't matter, but his wife. And Miranda has to deal with a lot of things about her father's past and her own that she didn't know. She learns a little bit about what happened to her own mother, and she meets some friends that assist her in this. I won't go into too much detail about this one. You can go to my January wrap-up if you want to hear more about it. But this is a good one if you are looking for a historical fantasy that has like a twist on the original story, some interesting character motivations and plot. And also if you like sapphic love stories, there's a cute one in here. I do have to say that it's not a favorite of mine just because it is really short, and I feel like if it had been 100 pages longer, that would have really helped it. But I would recommend it to anybody who likes the things that I listed. Okay, now it's time for Romeo and Juliet retellings. I already mentioned one with Ryan North's Romeo and/or Juliet. I'll just mention a couple more here. If you want sort of a darker, twisty-turny sort of fantasy, if you want like a darker, twisty-turny sort of fantasy novel here that's set in a really cool and unique place and time, then These Violent Delights by Chloe Gong I think would be a good one. Again, I discussed this in my January wrap-up. I won't go into too much detail here, but it's set in 1920s Shanghai, and if Romeo and Juliet in 1920s Shanghai doesn't sound cool to you, then I don't think you're human. The book does a good job of setting up the world and the history behind what was happening in Shanghai at this time. There was clearly a lot of research that went into this book, but I still felt that it read pretty well. It was fast-paced. I really wanted to turn the pages. And there's a cool fantasy element here as well. There is a bug that when it bites people, like causes them to tear out their own throats. Romeo and Juliet here are from a Russian gang in Roma's case and a Chinese gang in Juliet's case, and their gangs have been at odds for a long time, but they're both trying to find a solution to this issue. I thought some of the writing could use some work, and also some characters were not quite as fleshed out as I would have liked. But overall, I really enjoyed this. I'm probably going to read the sequel, and I would recommend it if you are looking for something with a lot of energy and a really meaty, interesting setting. Next Romeo and Juliet retelling is Prince of Cats by Ron Wimberly. This is a graphic novel version set in 1980s Brooklyn. It also deals with gang wars. I read this last year and I wanted to love it so badly because I thought the premise was so interesting. Unfortunately, I thought it was okay. The decisions that the story makes to focus on Tybalt, Juliet's cousin, rather than Romeo and Juliet was kind of interesting, but ultimately it didn't pay off for me. I felt like I didn't learn very much about Tybalt. I didn't know much more about him than I had reading the original play. And that goes for almost all of the characters. The plot was kind of scattered, so I had a hard time focusing on what was going on. And there was also this kind of weird mix of Shakespearean speak and modern speak that I was not a huge fan of. It often resulted in lines such as, "Yikes, verily thou givest too much information." Not my cup of tea, personally. But the art is really cool and eye-popping. I love the color scheme that this artist chose, and I have heard a lot of good things about it from other people, so if you're interested in that kind of setting in a graphic novel version of Romeo and Juliet, then I recommend this. Finally, at the very end, I'm going to talk a little bit about a retelling of Macbeth that I actually never finished, unfortunately, but I could see how someone else would maybe be into it. It's called Foul is Fair by Hannah Capin. I read another book by Hannah Capin in 2019, I think. It was called The Dead Queen's Club, and it was honestly great. So it's sort of a reworking of the court of King Henry VIII set in rural Indiana at a high school, and it should not have worked as well as it did, but boy, did it. I really, really liked this book. So I was really willing to pick up anything that Hannah Capin had to offer after that. I saw this book, and it was Shakespeare's birthday month. I decided to try it. In this retelling, the protagonist, Jade, is sexually assaulted at a party, and she decides to seek revenge on the group of boys that helped the guy do it. The writing is good in this. Hannah Capin is quite a good writer, so that part I enjoyed, but 50 pages in, I still didn't feel like I really connected to the character. I obviously understood like the anger that might come from Jade after the situation that she was in, but I just really wasn't into the whole revenge plan. I just thought it was a lot, and also none of the characters were really standing out to me. They seemed like very stereotypical YA in a lot of ways. It also seems to be like a setup for a more thriller type of story, and that's not really my type of story, so I decided to just put it down. But if you're in the mood for like a sort of really bitter, vitriolic, anger-driven thriller retelling of Macbeth, then I guess maybe you might like this. I hope you enjoyed my little pitch for some Shakespeare retellings. Hope you get to read them sometime, enjoy the nice spring weather or the terrible spring weather or the terrible fall weather. It depends on where you are in the world, and I'll see you all next time. Bye.